Welcome to the U.S. Technology Policy Committee's panel session for the afternoon. We're going to put up some slides here for with some information. So, Adam.
Momentarily, thank you.
But thank you all for tuning in. We hope this will be some lively discussion and an opportunity for you to ask some questions. There we go. Getting in here. So this is the hot topics for the day. Here's some important information about this webinar. And first, note that this is being recorded and will be archived for later public viewing. If there are any journalists attending, remarks are on background, please consult with us before using any of those quotes with sources. There is live captioning if you need it or want it. The attendees, your microphones are muted and your chat is muted. We won't see that on the panel. If you have a question that you want to ask, please type it in the Q&A panel and we'll bring it up to the panelists. And what I will do is select from the questions that are available and pose them to the panel. There's a message there that you can use with your chat if you have some kind of a problem with your connection. So, next slide. There we go. And this is basically just a mention of, we'll say our sponsor, but all of us on the panel are members of the U.S. Technology Policy Committee. This organization has been in existence for over 25 years, and it is ACM's focal point for interaction with various U.S. and state government organizations, the computing community and the U.S. public, on issues of policy as they relate to computing. And this includes all matters of U.S. public policy, not simply the ones on security that we'll be talking about today, security and privacy. USTPC is actually authorized by ACM as the only subgroup that can take official positions for ACM in the policy arena. But we are a non-lobbying organization. That is, we are neutral on many things. We can't lobby any of our elected representatives or appointed officials. On the right are some examples of some recent policy statements that you can find at our website at the bottom of the page. So if you just go to www.acm.org public policy, you'll be able to find a number of links there that discuss the committee and some of the various opinions that we have published, some of the activities of the committee in the recent past. Next slide, please. There we go. We welcome if anybody who's listening in or watching the recording of this panel is interested in these issues of the intersection of computing and policy. You're welcome to join the committee, and it's easy to do. There's just a few steps here. First of all, you have to be sure that your membership in ACM is current. Then you mail the ACM policy office at that address with your name, your ACM member number, and just a brief bio. You should also pick at least one of the subcommittees of the group that you're interested in following and working with, and they're all listed on our webpage. The Secretariat, which is the leadership of the committee, will review your application, and shortly thereafter, you should get an email welcoming you to the committee. We're always happy to add new members. And with that, we're going to start our panel. Each of our panelists is going to say a few words to get us started, and then we'll launch into some questions and discussion. So working here around on my screen. If Professor Ed Felton, if you're able to give your comments first.
Sure. So this is a multifaceted problem. We've had a lot of attention lately because of the ransomware attacks. But I want to talk about two aspects of what has to be a very broad and multifaceted response to these sorts of attacks. The first is the question of how we ensure that the companies and organizations that are operating our important infrastructures are actually keeping up with the basic security practices they need. And really the goal here should be to have a comprehensive and somewhat unified policy of regulation, and one that aims not to hit a high mark, but to consistently hit a basic set of security practices that are needed. And I think that's an important part of the issue. But I also want to talk about something that that I think we sometimes neglect in talking about this, and this is the role of action, especially by governments, to try to make it more difficult for the attacker groups to organize themselves. Many of the groups that carry out and organize these ransomware attacks are organizations in the classic sense of the term. Like many organizations, they face problems of how to coordinate their activities and how to maintain accountability internally. This is an especially difficult problem for criminal organizations. Many people were surprised, I think, to learn that Al-Qaeda, for example, had an HR group and had travel reimbursement paperwork. If you didn't submit receipts, you wouldn't get reimbursed. So many of these organizations, any organization of size, becomes a kind of bureaucracy and has problems of organization, motivation, and internal trust. And when you have a distributed organization and a criminal organization, there are opportunities to try to sow discord and disrupt by creative action. And this, I think, needs to be part of the strategy overall. It's a little bit odd, I think, to start with my leadoff comments to talk about this, which I think is not at the head of our line of responses, but I wanted to make sure that that one got measured. This is an area in which we need to play defense better than we do. And I would start with regulation as well as awareness, but we also are going to need to be able to play offense, and not just to try to steal back the money, but just to try to make it harder for criminal groups to organize themselves. And with that, I'll pass the baton back to Spaff, who is muted.
Thank you, Ed. And next up, I'd like to ask Professor Steve Bellovin to make his initial comments.
Thanks, Gene. So I was going to just focus on some very pragmatic things. If you want to stay secure, doing the basics gets you a very long way. Stay up to date on patches, multi-factor authentication, backups that you keep offline. You know, this is not going to help you outrun the bear or the cozy bear or the crazy bear or whatever kind of bear we're dealing with today, but it makes you a lot harder to get. And often the attackers are just going to go someplace else. You know, there was a very interesting article in the New York Times last week about the former chief security officer at the Democratic National Committee, how just concentrating on the basics prevented the kind of hack that happened to the DNC in 2016. The basics really count for a lot. Again, it's not going to protect you fully if a major intelligence agency wants to get you, but it gets you very, very far. Basic technology and a bit of basic policy. In terms on the policy side, I wanted to turn to President Biden's new executive order on cybersecurity, in particular to his order instituting a cybersecurity safety review board, an analog to the NTSB. So a body that's supposed to go look at what happened after a cybersecurity incident affecting particular, especially civilian government systems and probably critical infrastructure. It wasn't quite clear in the order. This is a really good idea, and one I've been advocating for about 10 years, but it needs to go further. One of the reasons that air travel is so safe is that every airplane crash is investigated. There's a voluntary, eventually anonymized near-miss reporting process that everybody gets to learn from. Notably missing from President Biden's order was a requirement for the reports to be made public. The reports have to be objective, not pointing fingers. They're not for prosecution. That's the FBI's job. They're not for counterintelligence. That's for the intelligence community. It's not for pointing fingers at the intern who typed a weak password. Why did the intern type a weak password? Why didn't the system catch it? Why did other systems with weak passwords not fall? What was the root cause or causes of the failure? Complex systems fail in complex ways, and we need to understand exactly what went wrong, or in the case of near misses, what went right to prevent the attacker. So we need these reports, and we need them to be detailed, objective, and public. Yes, there are all kinds of issues, including legal liability, but this is the sort of thing that has helped tremendously in aviation and transportation, in many other fields. And we really need this so we can all learn. How that great sage, Alfred E. Neumann, said, learn from the mistakes of others. You'll never live long enough to make them all yourself. That's what we need. Spaff?
Thank you, Steve. And next up, Dr. Rebecca Herold.
Thank you very much, Spaff. Before I start, I am required, though, to make clear that what I provide today represents my own opinions and recommendations. I am certainly not representing the views or recommendations of any of my clients. It's coming from me and no one else. So to start off, I want to borrow from Charles Dickens, one of my favorite writers. So today is the best of technology times, and it is the worst of cybersecurity times. But you know what? This would have also been an accurate statement in 2010. It would have been an accurate statement in 2000. It would have been an accurate statement in 1995 and before. We are always behind when it comes to cybersecurity when we're dealing with new technology and new uses of technology. And today we have many new types of what can be very beneficial new tech. And I want to emphasize that because oftentimes when I speak with people about the risks, they tell me, why are you so against new tech? I am not. I love new tech. I just want to make sure that it's secure new tech and that it does not put others at harm. So I want to briefly list a few of the new tech because I think that's something that was very important to consider and would have been better to highlight a little bit more explicitly in the executive order. I think it's important to be forward looking when you're thinking about strategy and also understand that you are not doing something that has an endpoint. Once you start, you cannot stop with cybersecurity. You always have to do risk management and everything involved with that. So some new tech, IoT devices. So there are already at least 36 billion known IoT devices in use throughout the world. And it's projected that there will be 75.5 billion IoT devices used by 2025. But I am confident that this is a low number because there are millions of people who are building their own IoT devices. And so, of course, when they're building their own IoT devices, that's something that does not get put into these numbers that come from vendors, such as with Raspberry Pis. I mean, this is something that I actually used Raspberry Pis to represent electricity inverters when I was doing some research and testing on the smart grid a few years ago to see the vulnerabilities there. So we need to think about those IoT devices within our digital ecosystem. Then once you think about those, what does that lead to? It leads to mesh networks, such as those that were recently launched with Amazon Sidewalk. And of course, what did Amazon Sidewalk do? They said, well, hey, if you already have our devices, we're just going to go ahead and put you into this mesh network because we're confident that if you like our devices, you're going to love what this mesh network will do for you. It's going to go faster and you won't have those dead periods anymore. But guess what? It's also a type of new Wi-Fi protocol that they've basically launched without, I have not seen any testing for it. And it's involving at least 15 of their existing Alexa-enabled IoT devices. They have many more devices planned. And so those are going to become part of the mesh too, creating many new ways for hackers to get into the systems that are also attached to that mesh network through your home Wi-Fi networks that are attached to your corporate networks. So you need to think about that. And when you're thinking about that, also think about how IoT devices and mesh networks often also connect to cyber physical systems. So when I'm talking about cyber physical systems, we're talking about something large like the smart grid that I talked about earlier, but you also have CPS airplanes, ships, vehicles, highway systems, all the way down to the smallest type of device, such as sensors and actuators. You have smart pills that are so cool and they do such great things for health, and also similar types of tiny medical devices, micro scale robots. They're already widely used, and all of those are also expanding in use and numbers and types as well. So all of these are going to be out there, and you may or may not know if they are within your digital network in your corporation. Oftentimes too, you need to think about the fact that they're communicating with other devices through cloud-based infrastructure and interacting with what are often safety critical systems. So they're also creating new safety, security, and dependability risks. So it goes beyond just an outage of the internet. You're getting into impacting people's lives. They also provide pathways for hackers. When you think about it, you have the recent Verkada security camera breach that just happened. But you've been having these breaches for years. I mean, just recall in 2017, there was a smart aquarium tank in a Las Vegas casino, and hackers infiltrated into the casino network through the aquarium, and they exfiltrated over 10 gigabytes of data that was sent to where they were located in Finland. So these are just two of thousands of examples demonstrating that hackers find cyber physical systems to be easy to hack and easy to use as entry points to not only corporate, but to other types of networks as well, because oftentimes they're overlooked. You also have 5G. What is 5G? 5G is simply an all software type of cloud-based network operated through distributed digital routers, right? It's very decentralized. And that decentralization is something that really helps to optimize processing speed and power, but it is also software. And what is software? Is there any type of software that is 100% secured? Software is innately hackable. So we also have that. We have AI, which is prone to hijacking. We also have many, many other types of tech. So I guess my point today is that we have lots of new tech. I could go on for a long time, many new pathways. We need to address those too, because if we don't address the new things along with the old things, we're going to be in trouble. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And last panelist here, Professor Mark Rasch.
Thanks, Spaff. And so what I'm going to talk about for 4 minutes or 5 minutes tops is where we are, how we got here, and what we can do about it. So where we are in the area of cybersecurity is unfortunately exactly where the marketplace wants us to be. We invest exactly the dollar amount of resources and energy and knowledge and training that the marketplace demands. And that has to do, and it's nowhere near what is necessary in order to give us security, but it is enough to give us the level of security that we have that the marketplace says that we need. And so The question is, from a government perspective, from a trade perspective, from an industry perspective, from an international perspective, how do we move us from where we are now to an area where we have a lower risk? And should we? Because remember, we're going to spend money to reduce risk. The reason why there's a misalignment between what we're spending and how we're reducing risk and what the risk is for a couple of reasons. Number one, we don't have enough information about the nature of the risk. We don't have enough information about the nature of the vulnerabilities. When we roll out IoT devices or mesh networks, we see the advantages and we say, yes, roll it out. The advantages of the new technologies are obvious and easy to measure. The risks or potential risks are often hidden. All right, that's number one. Number two, the second reason we are where we are is because most of the things that we would do to reduce risk comes at a cost. And I don't mean the cost of paying for money and training and stuff like that, but let's take a very simple example. A solution to the problem of ransomware may be frequent backups. Just very simple. You back up the data, you get hit by ransomware, you extend your middle finger to the hackers, and you restore the data. You can move on. But backing up data creates its own set of risks, because now when you back up data, you now create a second data set that you now have to protect, that you have to monitor, that you have to patch manage and all that stuff. And then you also back up, you archive, you store. Now you have 3 data sets that you have to protect. The same thing is true with respect to encryption. We create stronger and stronger encryption, which is, guess what? The tools used by the ransomware purveyors to lock up our data. So many of the things that we do are cross purposes. We want to be able to forensically delete and wipe data when it's no longer necessary, but we also want to be able to recover it if we need to. So we're operating often to cross purposes. So that's where we are now. And then the next question is, how do we move to a better state of security? Now, we can talk, as Steve did, about doing the basics, and we need to do the basics. We are not doing the basics because the basics are hard. They are expensive to do them right. And even if we do the basics, the more sophisticated bad guys are still going to be able to get in, right? So how do we encourage people to just do the basics? And there are a couple of things that we can do. We need to move the marketplace, move the needle of where the marketplace is, so that it is much cheaper to do the basics than it is to survive the risks of doing so. Second thing is we need better and more information. Third, we need cooperation. If somebody else has solved the problem, and Steve was talking about doing these after action reports that are recommended, sort of like the FAA crashes, we need them in real time. We need real-time information sharing without consequence or without risk. And then we need rewards. So those are the basic things that we have. I come at this as a lawyer, a former federal computer crime prosecutor, and I see some legal barriers that need to be removed as well. But that's where we are now.
Thank you, Mark. So I would ask the attendees who are watching this panel, if you have some questions you'd like to pose for discussion, please enter them in the Q&A. We have one there now, but I'm going to start with one that sort of sets the stage and I think adds several topics here for us to think about. Ransomware has been in the news a lot recently, not simply the Colonial Pipeline incident, but there have been others. In fact, the FBI says they're currently tracking over 100 separate instances of ransomware that are in regular use, and there are on the order of dozens, if not hundreds, of instances of malware instantiated every day. This is a huge problem, but it's made worse by, as you've all noted in one way or another, some of the things about not doing the basics, not understanding really the threat model, not taking appropriate care. But it's also a problem from the policy perspective, because we have different organizations that are charged with different aspects of protection and investigation. The FBI does the criminal investigation. DHS is responsible for protecting government systems. The NSA and Cyber Command are outward facing and are not supposed to be looking at US systems. And the hackers have taken advantage of that by locating some of their command and control on servers inside the US. And all of this creates a huge problem for industry and for private individuals. What do you have to say about this? The executive order that came out doesn't seem to have really much, if anything, that would address this kind of problem. What do you see as the fundamental issues here that could be addressed? So anybody on the panel?
I'll jump in first, because I'm shy and reticent. One of the things that you left out is the Treasury Department also threatening to prosecute people who pay ransom. So we have the government acting at cross purposes. One part of the government is saying, just do what you need to do to keep running because it's critical infrastructure, while another part of the government is saying, and we will throw you in jail if you do that. So that's one of the problems. But the problem with ransomware fundamentally is people have moved to ransomware because they can make money doing it. And as long as they can continue to make money doing it, then you're going to have the problem of ransomware. So how do you take the financial incentive out of it, or how do you prevent them from being successful? And from a prevention of being, or how do you make it so expensive for them to do it that it's no longer viable? So there's really three solutions. One, better hygiene to keep them from coming in. We've been trying that for 30 years. It'll work to some extent, but you'll only keep the incompetent ones out. Two, everybody agrees that they're not going to pay ransom, which creates the no, you go first problem. And number three, we find these people and we prosecute them, which is really, really hard to do because they have safe havens in other countries. So I'm afraid that we're probably stuck with the ransomware problem for a good long time.
Anybody else on the panel care to address that?
I'll jump in on this. And I want to hit again this point that Spaff made, I think, in the question, which is about how the government organizes itself to respond to the cybersecurity problem. And I worked on this some when I was on the White House staff. One of the big challenges here is that within the government, cybersecurity is everyone's job, but not exactly anyone's job. That is, there are many different parts of the government that work on or focus on or look at one little aspect of the cybersecurity issue. Not only do agencies have their own cybersecurity issues with securing their own operations, but if almost so many regulatory agencies that might regulate a sector, or say the FTC doing consumer protection has aspects of this that they work on, there is a real fragmentation of responsibilities, and that makes it difficult to coordinate, and it makes it really difficult to maintain a coherent strategy and to take a global view, where the only place really, at least the experience that I saw, was the only place where the policy conversation came together to look at this issue from end to end and in a coherent way was sort of near the top of the pyramid of the government, right? It was a National Security Council meeting. And we need to have better ways of devising and carrying out a coherent strategy within the government on these issues. It's not clear what we can do to organize ourselves to do that better, but it's definitely a problem.
I have Steve next with a comment on this.
Yeah, I'm going to key off of what Mark said. I won't disagree with that we need a coherent response, but what Mark said is that there's not any one answer. We need a multifaceted response. The reason I say backups, well, you need backups because your disk is going to die at the most inconvenient time anyway, and you need to make sure you actually test your backups and know how to restore them from them and so on. The stories I could tell about that, but if you don't deter them and your defenses fail and good hygiene isn't enough because they're too sophisticated, then what do you do? And the answer is you either pay or you restore from your good protected backups or you're out of business. And to me, backups are a good idea because disks fail. I've got more than 50 years of experience in this business. Disks fail at the worst possible time.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca, did you?
Yes, I agree with what was said, but I want to take a practitioner's point of view now as well, because I think we need to start thinking differently. We need policies. We need to know what government agencies can do to help, but we also need at the organizational level to start thinking differently about how we are going to protect against ransomware, how we have architected our network, how we can put some stop points, some speed bumps in our network to identify where they might be coming in. But very importantly, you need to increase your training of your employees so that they can better identify when they might be doing something that could bring the ransomware in. And I think there's not nearly enough training yet that's out there. I still talk with organizations who only want to give training once a year and they want to do it for an hour and then forget about it. You need to have it ongoing so you can address this issue by making a much higher awareness in each person who's on your network.
All right, thank you. We have a number of questions here from the audience. And the first one that was posed is about ransomware. The FBI managed to take back over half the money that Colonial allegedly paid as part of their ransom. And this questioner said how, although I'm not sure that was disclosed. I doubt any of us have inside information. But more interestingly, do you think the FBI is going to make it a policy to help in money recovery going forwards? Anybody? Mark?
The answer is going to be in the large dollar value ones, yes. In the ones that seem to have national security implications, yes. And they're going to try to do more than that. One of the things they're going to do is, remember, in a ransomware, you've got two lines of communications between the victim and the ransomware perpetrator. You've got the payment system, which is a line of communication. And then you've got the ransomware demand and the negotiations and all that stuff. So what the FBI is going to do is they're going to leverage both of those to try to figure out who it is, or at least, or use affirmative warfare and go after the person there. They will do both of those. But they've been trying to do it in the past. One of the reasons why the FBI was able to claw back some of this money is they were already working intimately with Colonial in making the payment. So they were able to track the wallets and stuff like that. So the earlier you bring the FBI on board, the more likely you may be to be able to get some satisfactory result at the end of it. But remember the other part, where the Treasury Department is saying you're committing a crime when you pay the ransomware, and now you've invited the FBI to watch you commit a crime.
Okay.
I'll add one technical point. Do we know how they did it? The affidavit with the application for order to let them seize it said we have the private key. They did not say how they'd obtained it. I can think of lots of possibilities depending on exactly how this Bitcoin wallet was maintained, but they did not say. They said we have it, and that's all we're going to find out unless and until we hear about it in court, I suspect.
And by the way, hackers have bad hygiene as well.
Okay. Let me move to two other questions here, and I'll pose them together because they're related. Where we're talking about this board that will look at major incidents and analyze them, and the idea of information sharing and disclosure. These two questions: one, if we disclose this information, particularly to end users to make them aware, won't that also educate the attackers about what they did that succeeded or didn't? And do we need a set of laws around this, not more than an executive order, but a set of laws similar to what we had with Y2K, where we can enforce sharing and the industry can't be sued for that, which is something that is a concern in many industries, because we want to be able to have that to be widespread, not selective. Anybody want to take on that? Steve, I see you've got your hand raised there.
I'm never shy. You know, so I read an essay, I actually quoted it in a book about in the physical world, about picking locks and vulnerabilities in locks, and whether it's okay to discuss vulnerabilities in locks. And the author's answer is, hey, the criminals already know about these vulnerabilities. We may as well tell honest people what they're buying, what they're not. And here's the kicker. That quote is from 1853. This debate has been going on for a very long time. And I've seen nothing to make me change my mind over this. A specific high risk vulnerability, you know, around 1991, I came up with one and I shared it within the government. And I shared it with trusted parties who apparently shared it with others. And first of all, someone else reinvented it. Spaff was one of your students. And what finally made me go public and publish my paper was when a copy of the paper was found on a hacker's disk drive. It had somehow leaked. You know, unless you can go all out on security controls, it's not going to work. We have to tell the good guys what to do. And once it was out there, by the way, other people figured out better solutions.
Mark, you have some comments?
Sure. So a couple of things. Number one, we already have these birds of a feather group or these ISACs that are designed to allow people to share in a trusted environment vulnerabilities and threat information, or to share it in an anonymized manner. What we don't have is we don't have compulsory reporting. The problem with compulsory reporting is compulsory reporting of what? We don't even know what information other people need to know. We have tens of thousands of attacks going on at every institution all the time. What is it that's important to share? What will move the ball along? And to whom do we share it? And the other problem is this. If the CIA is going to start reporting back to Citibank when it's been hacked, then the FBI can expect those institutions to report back to them. Unless the government is also willing to report its vulnerabilities, particularly in the area of national security, and saying, look, we believe that reporting of vulnerabilities is essential to make everybody safe, you're not going to have that kind of trust that you're going to need. The problem with giving immunity is that you may be doing a terrible job of securing your system and telling everybody you're doing a great job. You get hit, and now you report it, and you say, aha, I'm now immune. You can't sue me for having terrible security. And since one of the things that moves the ball along is fear of liability, I'm not sure that you should be granting those people immunity. But that's, again, one of those things we need to discuss.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I think as Mark mentioned about trust, that is a huge factor for organizations to be able to share this type of data, because there's a lot of implications, not just legal implications, but there's PR implications. They don't want to have competitors to use vulnerabilities that are associated with their company as a marketing way of coming against them and taking some of their clients. So I think a really important aspect is, how are we going to trust that the data that's being provided is going to be secured? It's not going to be shared, inappropriately, and even have some sort of way such that organizations can make themselves anonymous to everyone except for the folks who are using that data to help to resolve the issue. If that makes sense. There's a big schema there, but yeah, I think the trust factor is a huge part of the reason why there's resistance to this.
Okay. Well, there are a number of questions here that are all somewhat related to issues of cost. So one says, in the calculus that companies have for whether to invest more in security, is ransomware and similar kinds of behavior simply a tax or they believe it to be a cost of doing business as long as it's kept low enough. Then along a little bit further on, there are questions about at what point and what role do insurance companies have in helping to prevent companies from just accepting it all as risk. So anybody care to respond to that?
I guess I'll talk a little bit. If okay, you can't hear me. Apologies, I lost my network a few minutes ago. I'll talk a little bit about the role of insurance, right? Insurance does two things. First, it lets you transfer risk from one party to another. But importantly, it creates a situation where an insurance company has more visibility across different organizations. An insurance company can act as an aggregator and analyst of information about the experiences of those who have bought policies from them. And then they can exert back pressure onto companies to adopt better practices. In the same way that your insurance company will charge you different amounts based on, say, what kind of car you have or what kind of fire suppression equipment you have in your building. And that produces economic pressure for people to behave efficiently. And that, of course, is driven by analysis that's done by insurance companies and the insurance industry. We can hope that if insurance plays a bigger role in this space, that the insurance companies will be an aggregator of information and will drive more efficient decision-making about how to reduce these costs.
Rebecca, you were going to make a comment?
Yeah, building upon what Ed was saying, I think a very important part of this is going to be the cyber insurance companies establishing programs that do outline what organizations need to have in place for their data and cybersecurity programs, and then validate them. There's been a lot of times when organizations get cyber insurance and they say they have protections in place, and then they didn't, and something happens, and then the insurance company gets caught holding the bag and paying, and they're not going to keep doing that. So I think you can expect to see in the near future a lot more stringent requirements from cyber insurance companies to validate that the insureds actually have strong security programs in place.
Steve.
Well,
Okay, yeah, so all of that is true. I note that things like the National Electrical Code came out of the fire insurance industry. One of the problems we have is that configurations and usages and the way we use our systems are so very, very different that one size does not fit all. And it's very hard to come up with a checklist that goes beyond the basics as opposed to needing expert review. I think it's a good idea. I'm a big fan of it. I wonder if we need to go more in the direction of liability, which at some level is blocked by the EULAs, the end user license agreements, which shield the vendors from liability unless they perceive that their insecurity is so great that it's an existential threat to them as a company. And that's happened. You know, about 20 years ago, Microsoft started feeling that. They got religion on security. They've done a very good job since then. But it's a problem.
Mark?
Yeah, two other things. One thing has to do with the cyber insurance, and I think Rebecca's right when she talks about how they become the standard setter. The problem is their business model is based on selling policies and not paying claims. And so right now, if they have somebody that they put stringent requirements on you to become a customer, you won't become a customer, or maybe not a customer of theirs. So they have these competing values. The people selling the policies want to say, oh, you want a policy? Here's a policy, without any requirements. And the people paying claims want to have strict requirements so they don't have to pay the claims. So you got these two divergent business models within the insurance industry. And the second problem is one that I'm sure Rebecca is familiar with, is one of the problems is we are not capturing the true societal costs of breaches or of this stuff. And that is because fundamentally, we do not value privacy. Not that we don't think privacy is important, but we don't attribute an actual dollar value to privacy. So if I am responsible for a database of 1 million records, and I say, if that 1 million data records are breached and public, what's the cost going to be? The answer is, I have no idea. For credit card numbers, we have a lot of historical data. We know it's $30 each to replace, multiply by it, figure out the probability of it happening, and you have an underwriting number. But for a medical record, so if I'm a lawyer and I have somebody comes to me and says, the records of related to my open heart surgery were publicly disseminated by the hospital for bad security, can I sue? The answer is yes. What's the dollar value I'm going to ask for? I don't know. What's the harm? I don't know. And without knowing that, without valuing data, we can't value breaches, and we can't assign an economic value to preventing them.
Rebecca, you've done some work with HIPAA regulations.
Yeah. Well, with HIPAA, there's actually been a lot of interesting cases. I've even done some expert witness cases for HIPAA with regard to whether or not an organization, one was a hospital system, in a different case, an insurance company, whether they actually were meeting all of the HIPAA requirements. So when you start thinking about cyber insurance and whether or not you were doing what was expected, there are already some standards, if you will, or people now view them as standards because they've been out there long enough, that they expect that organizations will have a comprehensive framework of protections in place, and it's a matter of making sure that you have them filled. Now, yes, you can't have a structure that's going to name every type of operating system or browser or application, but you can use a framework that deals with security domains and start building from there to see whether or not those have been met. And then with regard to what Mark was talking about with value, it's also important to consider that when you're dealing with health insurance, those actuarial tables that determine what health insurance would be, those took decades to create. We're still relatively young in the cyber insurance space. Our actuarial tables that are trying to determine what to charge for different types of breaches, especially breaches that haven't even happened yet, don't exist.
And the threats have changed completely as well.
So related to some of this, there are a couple of questions that, again, I'm going to try to combine a little bit. Someone observed that in the past, there were groups in Russia that were doing music piracy. And because Russia doesn't have extradition with the US, we couldn't really seem to do much about the individuals. But Russia was blocked from the World Trade Organization until they shut them down or made them move somewhere else. And the question there is, why is music more important than security? Why can't we get international pressure against ransomware? And combined with another question further down is do any of our allies who might help with such pressure, are they suffering similarly, or are they just standing by on the sidelines watching US companies get hurt? Comments?
That's an Ed question, I think.
You're on mute, Ed.
Yeah. Well, yes, other countries certainly are hurt badly. You can look at places like the UK. They've had very serious issues with ransomware, including in their health system. We are far from the only country that suffers from ransomware attacks. And there is some concerted effort. There's effort to put pressure on governments. There's effort to use other instruments of national power to try to make things more difficult for ransomware groups. And you read in the paper about the FBI or someone in the U.S. government stealing back the ransomware money from the Colonial Pipeline incident. So there certainly are things going on. There may be a bit less, public, and maybe a bit less performative, let's say, than some of the responses to copyright infringement. But it is, I think, something that's being taken seriously by our government and our allies.
Mark, or someone?
Well, sure. The problem is it's an incredibly blunt instrument to essentially cut off an entire country from access to the internet, which is what you would have to do in order to punish a government for sponsoring or merely tolerating or failing to investigate and prosecute criminal activity. So there are lots of other tools of statesmanship that we can use short of that. But it is something that is available. But remember, all it will do is it will push the purveyors of ransomware to another IP address or another location.
Let me, Steve, you've got.
Yeah, I was to say a lot is also going to depend on attribution and attribution being believed. Attribution is not impossible. It takes a lot of skill, takes a lot of background, takes a lot of experience. It's not impossible, but sometimes the methods aren't easily explainable, or sometimes they're classified because of a database of incidents. I heard the then head of the NSA state categorically that North Korea was behind the Sony hack. I've seen many well-respected computer security people saying, show me the evidence, I don't believe you. Whom do you believe? A well-respected computer security person or the head of the NSA? Both could have other agendas. And how do you take action without good attribution? The music piracy thing, by contrast, was a lot easier because these things tended to be living at fixed addresses.
Okay, thank you.
And attribution is a double-edged sword, because the same tools that you use to attribute hackers can also be used to attribute dissidents and people protesting and the like. So attribution, there are genuine and legitimate reasons to preserve anonymity and pseudonymity as well. That's why this stuff is hard. If it was easy, we would have solved the problem years ago.
Let me switch to a different topic here. We've covered a lot related to ransomware and its related issues. Someone noted that in a recent article in Communications of the ACM, particularly the January issue, there was something that talked about our government, being the US government, stockpiling software vulnerabilities such as zero-day exploits in case they might need to use them to gain access to some of their entities' computer systems. So what are your thoughts on this type of practice? Is this a good idea, bad idea? How should this work? That's a loaded question, I realize, but
it doesn't matter if it's a good idea or a bad idea. It's an inevitable idea, okay? Because we operate at cross purposes. At the same time that we want to make everybody secure and make it invulnerable for our adversaries to get at our secrets, we also want to be able to get at our adversaries' secrets. And so this is an inevitable give and take because we are all dependent on the same infrastructure.
Steve?
So the government has something called the VEP, the Vulnerabilities Equities Process. It applies to, I think it applies to the NSA, not to the FBI, but they look at the vulnerability and they say, how useful is it to the NSA to have this vulnerability for its purposes? How serious a risk does it pose to US companies and US infrastructure? One of my colleagues at Columbia has estimated that I think they even said, I'm sorry, the NSA has said that 90% of the vulnerabilities they find, they disclose. I'm on record as saying that government should generally report it because it seems to take about a year between the time a vulnerability is discovered before patches are widespread. So you've got plenty of time to exploit it in the meantime. And I also believe that vulnerabilities are dense. I don't have a big enough magic wand to fix all of the many holes in software. I can dream about it, but I don't have that big a magic wand. And vulnerabilities are dense. There's always going to be another one.
Here's another question that's a little policy related. And basically, we've talked about, we have the FBI, we have the Department of Homeland Security, we have Cyber Command, we have Secret Service, the Treasury Department, and on, that all have some role to play in cybersecurity. Should we be creating a singular agency that's responsible for all cybersecurity, roll these up into it? Now, this is really more a policy question than anything else. What are the risks and benefits to this? And I'd like to pick on Ed first because of some of his work in government to talk about why this is difficult or what it might take.
Sure. And I had maybe a little rant earlier about the difficulty of coordinating all the different cybersecurity missions across all of the different agencies. And that's really a known problem that the government struggles with. So you might say, well, then obviously you should create a single agency to run this, right? But now you have, you had N agencies before, now you have N+1 agencies, right? And you have a new agency, which is probably smaller than say the DoD or NSA or some, the Department of, or the Department of the Interior even. Now it's supposed to be bossing them around. And how you make that work is actually pretty hard. I do think it's important to have more coordination and to have some entity within the government that can see the whole picture and speak with a single voice. I think it's hard for that in practice to be outside the White House, just in terms of how things are organized. I think there's a lot of challenges around a new agency. The biggest one being, how could you ensure that what this agency says should happen actually does happen across all of the other agencies in the government? And I don't have a solution to that other than make sure that whoever is running this thing has the ear of the most senior leadership in the government.
Well, there's an interesting aspect here that we've learned with USTPC over the years as well, that if something like that were to occur, it would take away some of the budgeting and prestige and authority that congressional committees in both the House and the Senate would have. And they're very loath to do that. So getting approval through Congress would be difficult. Yes,
right. Because as you said, there's one committee would get to oversee this, and N-1 committees would lose authority and lose oversight power.
Rebecca?
Yes. So I guess what would concern me about one area that's controlling cybersecurity is, would they do it in a way that it would not make that a single point of failure that could lead to, let's say, a malicious insider who got into that area causing bad things to happen? We've seen that in other organizations before. And so when you're talking about the government, because it is so big and because there are so many very critical services being provided, you'd have to have certainly a lot of oversight and control over what they were doing to ensure that one person couldn't wreak havoc throughout all of the agencies.
Steve?
Yeah, there's a famous quote. I believe there's Harry Truman giving advice to Eisenhower, and Eisenhower is about to take office, which is, I say, do this, do that, and nothing happens. That echoes what Ed was saying. It's very hard to affect the bureaucracy in the way you want to do. And remember, Truman was describing this about 70 years ago when the government was a heck of a lot smaller than it is today.
All right, well, let's move on to another topic here. And I think this is an interesting one. It also meets a little bit with the executive order that recently came out on security. The question with the cloud services, the AWS and Azures of the world, various public clouds, are they making the problem better or worse? And in particular, is there a false sense of security being created at organizations because they're using these managed services rather than having their own individual systems that they know they have to protect themselves? Steve, why don't you start on this?
Especially for small and medium-sized companies, I'm a very big fan of them. Yes, there are risks. No, they're not perfect. They're almost certainly better than you are, especially for things that are high risk, like very difficult to manage well, like email. Again, not perfect. You still have to use them correctly and not leave your Amazon S3 buckets wide open, all sorts of configuration mistakes you can make. They are still better than you are at doing a lot of the basics. And you're almost certainly better off going with a cloud provider when you can.
Anybody else? No. Oh, Rebecca.
Yeah, I would just say something that concerns me, and I see it as a growing problem, is the supply chain from those SaaS services. So I wish that they would provide more insight into the supply chain so that we know how they are validating the security of the supply chain. That's where probably I have my biggest concerns right now with most cloud services, SaaS services, but otherwise, for small to mid-sized businesses, certainly they can provide more security for certain things than the organization itself could if they had their on-site hardware and software.
Another thing also with cloud security is a disconnect between what the cloud customer thinks, who they think is responsible for security, and who the cloud provider thinks is responsible for security, and where the border between the two begin and end. And that has to do with the fact that these cloud agreements are impossible to read. Okay, I've read hundreds of them. They are impossible to read because I can't tell you, even reading them, who's responsible for security. And there's a difference between cloud security and secure cloud. One provides you a cloud that is secured, one provides you a cloud that you can secure, and one provides you security technology that you can apply to the cloud. And it's a mess. The second problem is a common vulnerability. If you find a vulnerability in a cloud provider, that may persist throughout hundreds of thousands of customers. So that's another problem as well. So cloud is good, cloud is bad. You know, I've looked at clouds from both sides now.
Well, we saw just yesterday that one vendor could take down dozens of companies, agencies that are using cloud connections. So there is that common vulnerability that you mentioned. That,
well, and there's one other thing from a legal perspective as law enforcement, and that is anything that's on the cloud can be subpoenaed or gotten a search warrant for without you knowing about it. The huge difference between something on the cloud and something in your own enterprise is if a government agency wants to get compulsory process for something in your own enterprise, they have to tell you they're getting it. If they're trying to get it from a cloud provider, they tell them that they're getting it. That's a huge difference in terms of control.
that was a story this week as well for CNN. That's how they found out that one of their reporters was being,
That's right.
the records of the reporter were being looked for. Ed, you had a comment on this?
Sure. I mean, I guess I think I tend to concur with Steve that for most users, most organizations, using cloud services is a good choice. That these things are best left to the professionals in terms of management and security management. To use a reputable cloud provider is probably a plus on the whole from a security standpoint. I think too many people are afraid of the cloud and the security implications of the cloud when they would be better off outsourcing more of what they do. I think that's true in general. I think too many organizations and people are devising their own security strategies instead of relying on services that, although they may cost a little bit more, are going to save you from a lot of mistakes that you probably don't even know are possible to make.
Rebecca?
Yes, just one more point about that. I agree that a lot of times the cloud services can be good, but to my opening, there's a lot of new tech out there that people are bringing in. People are walking with computers all over their bodies. And so those are being incorporated within their corporate networks. Sometimes you don't even realize it. So even if you are using a cloud service that's very secure, you are still going to have your own computers and systems within your own organization. So that's something I always tell my clients. It's like, just because you're using an MSP does not mean that you don't have security and privacy risk right here within your own office. So I think that's important for them to keep in mind. They can't outsource everything. They still have to be responsible.
Well, I'm going to jump ahead to another question here that I think will provoke some lively discussion. Would it help to pass in the US a single federal privacy law like GDPR so that we can actually value the harms and the data and use that to encourage better security by organizations? So I'm going to say, Rebecca, this is really in your wheelhouse. So why don't you start on this?
Yes, there's so many benefits and so many non-benefits to that, because you think about right now, we have many regulations for industries. We have many state level laws and regulations. Organizations have put into place programs built around each of these different regulations. Would it help if we had one overall? I think it would in the long run. I think there would be a lot of pain to get a lot of the regulated industries to move to a new one if they had to move. So there might be the possibility that a federal regulation would be an add-on to what's existing, and it would fill the gaps of maybe protections that aren't there. So I think philosophically, I think it's a great idea, but when you get into the details of how you would do it, given where we're at now and moving forward from here, I think the devil's in the details again, what you would put into that federal regulation and how you would actually implement it, given all of the existing regulations and state and local level laws.
Steve?
Yeah, so I actually spend more time on privacy these days than security, and I think that a federal law on the subject would be an excellent idea with a couple of very big asterisks. The first one is if it's a weak law that preempts a comparatively strong law like California's, it's going to be a net loss. But the bigger problem is, what does it actually accomplish? You look at the detailed analyses of, for example, Virginia's law, and it's not clear how much it actually accomplishes. It's certainly weaker than California's. The devil really is in the details. All privacy regulation, every place, goes back to notice and consent, which goes back to the 1960s. Almost all the privacy and most of the security problems that we talk about were knowable and known in the 60s, early 70s. And I could point you to congressional hearings on the subject. And notice and consent has failed. We don't know what we're giving away and to whom, and we need a better paradigm for privacy regulation that isn't just notice and consent. That's my primary research area these days.
And just to follow up on that, I think what Rebecca was saying is the idea that a national law could be good if it's a good law. And Steve was saying that as well. And I think that one of the problems we have is that there is so much data being collected by so many people and used in so many different ways that if we went to a notice and consent model for that, people would stop doing business, and the only thing they would do is do notice and consent. I can't keep track of where my data is and what's going on with it. And I'm a privacy and security guy. I have no idea where the data from my iPhone is going and who has access to it. And I have no meaningful ability to opt in or opt out or know that stuff, and I never will. And with IoT devices, it's only going to get exponentially worse. So philosophically, if we adopt a model that says there's just some stuff you can't do, this is just not allowable, I don't care, and then there's some stuff you can do, and then some stuff that you need notice and consent for. We just need to philosophically change how we think about privacy, and then think about a regulation or law.
So Ed?
Yes. So I think a national baseline privacy law would be helpful. There are a great many problems it would not solve. But where we are today is not only that we have the problems that Mark talked about, that it's difficult to understand whether and how to consent or what the implications of consent are, where your data is going. That is, it's difficult for anyone to protect themselves by relying on the promises that companies make them in exchange for access to data. But also it's very difficult, even if a company is clearly violating the promises they're making, the resources that are available for simply for enforcing those promises are also, in my view, lacking. So we can make things better by having a baseline law that applies broadly and consistently, by taking some of the types of rules that have been applied in limited sectors and applying them more broadly, and by being more strategic about issues of enforcement and the structure of enforcement and regulation. So I think it's useful. It would be useful to have such a law, but we would not be living in privacy nirvana after this happened. We would be living in a marginally better world.
Yeah, when Google and Facebook pull out of Europe, you'll know that the GDPR is strongly protecting privacy.
Another couple questions here relate to effectively the environment in which we deploy security in the marketplace and government assume that a lot of what we've discussed, a lot of what's seen seems to be after the fact, analyzing after the fact, trying to prosecute or identify who committed these crimes after the fact. So how much of this is really the responsibility of, first of all, the victims? Should they be training more, as Rebecca talked about earlier? How much of it is the vendors of the various products that are being used, some of which are compromised or weak to be able to have this go forward? And for several of us here, we are researchers in this realm. What do we see about the nature of research and prevention? And is there any hope of really preventing the majority of these kinds of incidents? So that's a big question, but it goes to the whole environment that we're dealing with. So anybody want to tackle that first? Okay, Rebecca.
Yes, well, I'm going to approach this from an educational standpoint. This is something that for years, I come from a background of teaching and started out 7th through 12th graders. So I saw the earlier you can get training, education to people who are actually using tech, the better that they will incorporate security practices throughout their entire lifetime. I saw that with my sons, started them out when they were 4 and 6. They're more secure than anybody I know now because they grew up with it. I think we need in the US, actually worldwide, in our educational system, we need to incorporate within our curriculum cybersecurity and data security and make it part of the reading, writing, and arithmetic, because it's just as important now because everyone is online and everyone has a computer, some of them with it embedded in their bodies. They need to know how to securely use computers, how to protect their data, when to ask questions of people who are asking them to give them things over the internet and other things. So that's not a complete answer to your question, but I think as we get a much more informed population who actually grew up with this type of thinking, then we would see some changes. And of course, that's going to take a couple of generations to accomplish, even if we did get it into our educational curriculum soon. But still, we need to do that sooner rather than later.
Mark, what are your?
Sure. So I am hopeful, but not confident, that we may have a technological solution, because I think that if we can develop solutions that have ubiquitous encryption, that have virtualization, that exist on machines that are resilient against these kind of attacks, that the physical machines may be attacked, but the logical machines are not. If we have the data encrypted in a meaningful way, then I think that there may be some technological solutions. But remember, these are also human problems too. And you've got humans doing stuff, and humans not only are going to mess up, but they also have vested interest in not doing the stuff that works. So I think that we can do a much better job. We should be doing a much better job. And then I want to bring up the final thing, which I call the blizzard problem. And that is, we've had for 30 years this constant stream of malicious attacks. But even the worst attacks that we've ever had have been no more destructive than a blizzard. All right. That's good. On the other hand, blizzards are incredibly disruptive. All right. They cost billions of dollars, and we survive them, and we go on year after year. So we may just be at a steady state where we simply say, cost of doing business, let's just keep going.
Okay. Ed.
Sure. So I think we do need to do more to improve our technical defenses. And that starts with doing the basics right more often than we do. That's certainly important, but I also think that we really need to be attacking these issues from all directions. And I think the analogy to other forms of crime is really useful, right? We don't, with respect to other kinds of crime, like such as burglary, we don't rely on before the fact technical prevention alone. We don't try to make everything entirely burglar proof, but instead we have an understanding of where we need to be and how we can combine the use of technical barriers and policing and a broad vigilance and things like how well lit areas are and other sorts of methods to try to control and deal with the issue. So I think we need to look at it from all directions. We're going to need to try to prevent technically, to try to prevent through education, to try to get people to be more behave in a better and more consistently secure way. But at the same time, we're also going to need to do law enforcement after the fact. We're going to need to do international pressure. We're going to need to counterattack technically against groups that are large and organized and international when we're dealing with them. All of these things need to be part of the strategy.
All right. Mark, did you have another comment you wanted to make? Okay. So let me move to something that relates to this. It used to be small businesses, individuals, we didn't really need to have an internet presence. Now it's pretty much required for everyone because of email and ordering online and government records and all these other things. We're asking people to have a lot of internal and external controls, and this adds cost. And as we further develop these, there's further cost. How can we make that easier and relatively simple for the lower end of the population to deploy? And given the cost, is this something that perhaps, for instance, a government tax credit or grants could actually better subsidize and better encourage people to use better security? I realize that's a multi-part question with many aspects, but anybody want? Steve?
I'll take a shot at least part of it. This is one of the reasons why I said I'm such a big fan of cloud, because you can outsource a lot of the patching and so on to your cloud provider. Again, not all, but if you don't want to worry about the monthly updates to, for example, Microsoft Office, Word, Excel, etc., you buy yourself a Chromebook and you use Google Docs and let Google worry about that. They can worry, you don't have to patch your mail server if you're using Microsoft's Outlook.com. You know, it's not perfect. We're dealing in a more complex world. And the more sophisticated things you're trying, the harder it's going to be, no matter what. And again, the cloud providers, the online service providers don't always get this right. I had no idea until yesterday morning that the New York Times used Fastly as part of their distribution, or Twitter. I even saw some comment that Amazon was using, which I thought was a really fascinating comment, given that Amazon is the biggest cloud provider on their own. No one's got all the answers. It's a comment. Apple announced a virtual private network privacy thing yesterday, and it looks like it's a part of a deal with Cloudflare. So Apple, one of the biggest corporations on the planet, is outsourcing some of their privacy initiatives to somebody else. But the more you're trying to do, yes, it's going to be complicated. Everyone is trying to make this simpler. I assure you, as someone who's been doing system administration for about 55 years, it's a lot easier now to install a patch than it was back when I started doing this stuff.
Yeah, were you going to comment? Okay, Rebecca.
Yes, I agree that this is something that a lot of small to medium-sized businesses struggle with, but there is help out there. I mean, and I know I don't want to talk about my business, but I'll just give it as an example. Like some of the things that I've done is to provide monthly or quarterly meetings of groups of small businesses so that together we can discuss different topics as a group and they can ask questions. And it's not like they have to pay me an hourly rate to go to their office to be able to learn about things. And I'm not the only one. There's many other types of businesses that provide these types of co-op services so that small businesses can ask questions and it can be addressed in ways that fit their actual budget. But certainly managed system security providers do a lot, but you still need, those businesses still need to know what they need to do for full compliance, because even if you outsource security to an MSSP, you're still not going to meet all of the compliance requirements and the regulations and laws that apply to your business. So there's options out there.
Well, we've got 10 more minutes and 3 questions. So let's see if we can get through these or at least 2 of them. One, I'm going to go directly to Mark because your recent answer about the blizzard analogy. The point raised here is the difference between a cyber hack and a blizzard is that a cyber hack can be really catastrophic. Take out a power grid, a nuclear power plant, the nuclear force failsafe, destruction of the Hoover Dam. Does any of that change your calculus about how you look at that?
The answer is not really, because blizzards can do all those things as well, depending on the size of the blizzard and how destructive. And maybe not a blizzard, a hurricane, okay? And we saw Fukushima, okay? An earthquake. So these kind of natural disasters have a parallel to them. So the big difference is that these cyber attacks are man-made and adaptive, okay? And so what happens is the defenses we have to today's attacks will not be the defenses that we have to next week's, and they're also much less predictable. So I know it's an imperfect analogy, but in terms of overall cost and disruptiveness and stuff like that, at least, I think it's comparable in terms of damage and loss. That's neither good nor bad, because like I said, blizzards, hurricanes, tornadoes, that stuff are monumentally destructive, all right? But they have not taken out entire countries yet.
Rebecca, do you comment on this?
Yes, I do. So Mark and I will have to discuss this at some other time, but as an example, some attacks, you never know were an attack, but you do see some harms from it. As an example, I've been in hospitals and just opened up my back several years ago, BlackBerry Priv, and I was able to find 15 open access points into medical devices. Now, if I had been malicious, I could have shut down people's devices that were keeping them alive. And would they have known that it was because somebody shut it down through the network? Probably not. Maybe they would have. It depends on the logging. But I guess my point is that there's so many different devices becoming so ubiquitous throughout so many networks that if you aren't aware and address each of those devices, people can be doing bad things and you never know it. So even though it's not a blizzard, it's like a 1-ton hailstone falling on your head if somebody, you know, dies because they got to your medical device and shut you down.
All right, Ed?
Sure. And I think one can debate which is worse. And also, are we worried about one giant catastrophic attack or a wave of smaller attacks? But fundamentally, one of the big differences between this and natural disasters is that cybersecurity problems are caused by adversarial action. And that makes the dynamics fundamentally different, and it makes how you have to think about responding to them and preventing them in an entirely different kind of equation than you have with a natural disaster. So you, like I said, you can debate the severity, but I think in terms of strategy and how you respond, it's just a very different animal.
Yeah. Attackers don't obey the laws of probability. That's the big difference. You know, they're going to push systems into improbable states. It doesn't mean the damage could be the same, but you know, one of my nightmares is what happens when someone shuts off power or gas to Chicago in the middle of a serious cold snap. We saw what happened in Texas with just an ordinary natural disaster failure. And it could be really bad. Yeah, that's one of the nightmare scenarios. That's why critical infrastructure has to be treated differently.
Hey, Rebecca, you said a quick point here.
Just really quick, it's not always adversarial either. Poor programming practices and mistakes and just not having a securely built system that does not work as intended can lead to some very bad security problems as well.
Thank you. We are almost out of time, and unfortunately, there are a few questions still there that we didn't get to addressing. My apologies to those who asked them, but we'll take a really short, we'll give each of you 90 seconds for any concluding comments that you want to make here about all of this. Again, we could easily fill several hours or semesters with this material, but see what you can do in 90 seconds. And so who'd like to start? Ed,
I'm not sure.
Steve isn't shy.
Okay, Steve.
That's what I was going to start with. I'm not shy. There is no silver bullet. There's no magic solution to any of this. It's going to take a multifaceted approach. Better software, easier to configure, easier to use, more investigation, more deterrence, insurance, it's education. It's going to take all of this. It's not going to go away as a problem. We cannot fix it with any one solution.
Ed?
Sure. I think it's incumbent on those of us who work in the computer science field and who work at the intersection of policy to be thinking about what a better world, a more secure and sustainable technology infrastructure would look like, and how we could actually get there. What are the practices that we would like to see industry following? What are the practices that we would like to think we would follow if we were in charge? Not that anyone has a magic wand they can wave to make it so, but I think it's really valuable to think about where we could be and comparing that to where we are. That's, I think, a first step to understanding what it is we can do to move into a better position.
Rebecca, would you like to go next?
Yes, so I think also we need to keep in mind that old, existing, long-standing threats and vulnerabilities are still there because we're still using old legacy systems and we've kept adding on new types of systems. So do not forget to be aware of not only your new tech, which everyone needs to do a better job at that, and your existing, but look back to your old tech that is still there. As people retire who used to manage those and maintain them, I found organizations no longer are addressing them. I actually found an open modem, dial-up modem in 2015 that I could have gotten in through. If it's an opening, an attacker will get in. So make sure you address all the old while also adding on addressing all the new.
Mark?
We keep looking at information security as a cost and a huge cost, rather than looking at it as an enabling technology, that we can do all these great things if we have security. We don't look at the cost of brakes as a cost of a car. We look at it as part of the car, and that's how we need to think about security.
Thanks. Well, I'd like to thank the members of the panel and conclude by sort of circling back around to the beginning with a variation of Robert Courtney's third law, which is there are policy solutions to technical problems, but there aren't always technical solutions to policy problems. And USTPC as a group addresses these policy problems as best we can. A number of the questions we didn't get to are also topics that we have discussed in the group. We would encourage anybody who's interested in this area to think about joining us and adding to the conversation. The more of us who are able to contribute, the better we are going to be at coming up with solutions that make sense in the field. So we'll close out with this slide. Again, thanks to the panel. And on behalf of all of them and the USTPC, thank you for attending today.